Let's dive right in. This is an update to previous tutorials on working with molecules in Blender. It showcases a geometry nodes-based workflow together with Avogadro 2. As always, there are timestamps below. To start, we're going to download Avogadro 2, specifically version 1.99. I have linked the appropriate download page in the description. This version solves many of the problems with the previous workflows and seems to reliably produce double and triple bonds. With Avogadro 2 open, we're going to either import a molecule by name from File, Import, Download by Name, or you can build one using a SMILE string or international chemical identifier under Build, Insert. You can also draw your own molecules if you'd like. Note that Avogadro 2 sometimes crashes, particularly when working with chemical identifiers. For a wide variety of chemicals, you can find the SMILE string or the international chemical identifier on the respective PubChem page in section 2. We'll simply scroll down. I'm going to copy this entire text right here. I will take this over to Avogadro to build. For this example, we're using a simple molecule, specifically the structure of caffeine, which means it's very likely that I can simply import this by name. You can see this is our caffeine molecule right here, but if I wanted to, I could also go ahead and build, and using the international chemical identifier I copied, simply paste this, and I'll get caffeine. If you notice these blue spheres here, this is just because all of these are selected. You can undo that with Control, Shift, and A. Before I export the molecule, we're going to do a simple optimization. This can correct for a number of things and is particularly useful if you drew the molecule yourself. You can do this by simply hitting Control, Alt, and O, and on the build structure, you can see that there is essentially no change here. However, if we go to the one that was imported by name, once again, Control, Alt, and O, and you can see a slight shift here. This is now our optimized geometry based on Avogadro. With our molecule created, we can simply export the file directly as a PDB and move over to Blender. To do this, come to File, Export, and choose Molecule. I will name this molecule Caffeine. And under the type, I can either select, scroll all the way to the bottom of the list, and then around the top find PDB, or very simply, you can type .pdb at the end of the file. Go ahead and hit save. Avogadro 2 removes steps from the previous tutorials that relied on OpenBabel, so we can save, export, and go straight to Blender from here. In this video, I'm going to focus on using Blender 4.2. The first thing I will note is that if you do not need double or triple bonds in your molecule, then I recommend using molecular nodes. Otherwise, we can use Atomic Blender and GeoNodes that I have created to go with it. To install both molecular nodes and Atomic Blender in 4.2, we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, System, and we're going to enable Allow Online Access. In older versions of Blender, you would have to download molecular nodes from GitHub, and then you could install it through the Add-ons tab. Atomic Blender ships by default, you may just have to make sure that it's enabled. In 4.2 and onwards, there is an extensions platform where you can browse and install from remote or local repositories, so simply search for molecular nodes. This would come up from the extensions page on Blender. You can then update it or install it. Similarly, Atomic Blender is available by default, but it is not installed on the first round of starting up Blender. Once you install something through the extensions page, it stays installed on your system, and you do not have to revisit this, unless perhaps you update your version of Blender. Finally, under the Add-ons tab, we're going to very quickly, for Atomic Blender, just make sure that these boxes are checked. They can be useful. From here, we can close out, and we'll get started with molecular nodes. Before we get started, I'm going to simply delete the default cube. Then we're going to come to the Scene tab. We're going to scroll all the way down to the option for molecular nodes, which should now be available. And for the import method, we're going to change from download the PDB to local. This is going to give us the chance to find our molecule, and we're going to rename this caffeine. Under the style options, and there are a few, I'm going to import ball and stick. Then I'm going to find my specific file. We'll go ahead and accept this, and very simply, we can load the molecule. Note that molecular nodes tends to import models quite small. It is built on a different set of scaling units, and that's why we deleted our default cube, because otherwise we would not actually be able to see it. Also note how fast this was, and that this is pretty efficient, more or less regardless of the size of the molecule. Molecular nodes was designed to work with very significant clusters, and not really as much for smaller molecules. So for anything that you're going to throw at it is going to be pretty quick. All of that said, one thing that you may have noticed is that molecular nodes does not currently support double or triple bonds. My understanding is that those features may be coming in the future, but for now, we can rely on Atomic Blender if that's something that we really need to capture. I will also say that there are a number of customization options for molecular nodes that are accessible through the Geometry Nodes tab. Brady Johntson, the creator of this incredible add-on, has really put a lot of work into this. I will be discussing that more at the end of the video. Atomic Blender is a significantly older add-on, and the non-GeoNodes part of the workflow is compatible all the way back to Blender 2.79. In this video, we're going to use GeoNodes to work around some quirks of Atomic Blender's older system, but you could also follow my previous videos on using just Atomic Blender, which I have linked below. However, the GeoNodes do offer some new possibilities and efficiencies. Before we import with Atomic Blender, I'm going to point out the geometry nodes that I have designed for working with it. There are two sets of nodes, but we're mainly going to look at what I am calling atomic instances. Both sets are bundled with the CGFigures asset library, which is available for free. You'll either want to append the nodes to the existing file or use them through the asset library. In this video, I show the asset library workflow. With all that settled, we can now import our molecule using Atomic Blender. To do that, we'll go to File, Import, PDB. Once we've found and selected our file, I'm going to change some of the import settings. For balls and atoms, I'm going to change to mesh, and I'm going to drop both of these values down to just about 4. Very, very importantly, I'm going to double the distance on the scaling factors to 2. I'm also going to enable bonds so that I can access double and triple bonds. I'm going to increase the distance to 1, and I'm similarly going to bring the sectors down to 4 for the sticks and bonds section. I recommend saving this preset using the little plus icon, where we can call it whatever we want. This will let us reuse these settings in the future. From here, we'll go ahead and hit import, and you can see we have a very different setup compared to molecular nodes. The speed of the next part will depend on the size of your molecule and on your computer. With everything still selected, hit Ctrl-A, and then choose Make Instances Real. If you accidentally clicked away and deselected, you can right-click on the caffeine.pdb collection and choose Select Objects. Then again, Ctrl-A, Make Instances Real. If you have a very large molecule, Blender will take a second here. After this is done, we're going to simply hold down Shift, select any atom, and then hit Ctrl-J to join everything into one object. Again, for large molecules, this can take a very long time, which is part of the reason we imported such a low-resolution model. In the past, I've worked with ITIC4F, a high-performing material in organic solar cells, and timed this process to about 4 minutes of simply processing. If you click around during this time, Blender may say not responding. This is normal, and the process is much faster for smaller molecules. Really, again, for larger molecules, such as ITIC4F, it is just better to work with molecular nodes. Once everything is joined, we can do a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to start by hitting F2 and renaming this to caffeine. From there, I'll hit M and move this into the regular collection for the scene. Then I will right-click on the caffeine.pdb and delete the hierarchy. After this, I'm going to come to File, Cleanup, Purge Unused Data, and you can see I'm going to delete 20 meshes and 1 material. This just makes the scene a little bit lighter and better to work with. To do a quick before and after comparison, you can see that right now, before we purge, our scene has 30,000 verts, and that after we purge out everything and delete this, we bring this number down quite significantly to about 24,000. However, that is still a fairly significant amount of geometry. This is going to be quickly solved by our GeoNodes setup. I'm going to come to the Geometry Nodes tab, and I'm going to create a new Geometry Nodes tree. If you set up the asset library, the nodes should be available. If you hit Shift-A and come to CGFigures Assets, you'll see Atomic Nodes Instances and Atomic Nodes Mesh. If, however, you chose to append the specific nodes, they will be available under the Group option. The asset library setup is outlined in its own launch video, which I've linked in the description, but briefly you would download the zip file from cgfigures.ca, you would extract it, and then in Blender, under Edit, Preferences, File Paths, you'd use the plus icon, navigate to the folder where you created the library, and that would be it. As mentioned, there are two options from here, Atomic Mesh and Atomic Instances. We'll start with Atomic Mesh. Very simply, with Shift-A, add in the Molecule Mesh Setup node and drop this into place. We can also go ahead and add in a Render Smooth node, which will enable in the viewport and bring the subdivisions up to 2. you'll notice right away that we now have a populated geometry node setup that is differentiating between the atoms and the bonds. There are a few other useful controls here, and in Atomic Mesh, and in Atomic Instances, all of them work by using the materials imported by Atomic Blender, which are conveniently named after the elements of the molecule. So, if we would like to make the carbon atoms larger, we can specifically select for that by coming to Mesh, Adjust Scale. Let's scale atom by element. We'll put this in place, and then for the element, we can select the carbon material, and now we can adjust the scale of just that atom. We can also update these materials at any time and have them immediately be reflected in the viewport. Similar to the atoms, we can also adjust the bonds. So if we wanted to, we could say grab a scale, let's scale bonds by element, and we're going to adjust just the hydrogen bonds, which will make a little bit smaller here. Or rather, we'll make them larger. Something like that. You can see that this is actually preserving the geometry, so these are still connected. Atomic Mesh was the original system I drafted to work with Atomic Blender, but unfortunately it is somewhat inefficient, has a lot of geometry, and cannot perform certain functions. The oblong shape that we see here in our atoms is only due to the import settings from Atomic Blender and could be corrected by importing a higher resolution starting mesh. Instead of using 4x4 for the spheres, we would use 8x8. Unfortunately, again, that creates more geometry than we want, which is particularly undesirable for large molecules. In addition, scaling a bond size to 0 is non-trivial because this simply overlaps on the other side, so you don't go to 0 to get quite to 0, you have to kind of find the right number. And again, this depends on the import settings. Atomic Instances was created to resolve many of these issues. There are some complications with working with it, but it does give us more control further down the road. For the time being, I'm simply going to reconnect the original output. I'll grab our mesh nodes, and we're going to set these aside. We want to do a comparison to Atomic Instances at the end. So we'll put these down here, and we'll just focus on what we have, our original molecule. To set up with Atomic Instances, again, we're just going to hit Shift-A, we'll grab the core setup node, and we can drop it into place. Before I do, I want to make a note of how much geometry is currently in the scene, namely 24,000 verts. As soon as we put this in place, you can see this number has dropped down quite considerably to just about 1,000. From here, we're going to quickly ungroup this node by either right-clicking and choosing Ungroup, or using the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-G. I'll move these back over, and you can see this is essentially what Atomic Instances does. At its core, it is isolating the points corresponding to all the atoms, and also creating edges for all of the bond curves. We then subsequently build the atoms and the bonds, and combine them together with a set of materials. The complexity of Atomic Instances is because I designed these nodes using some basic assumptions, and as you can probably tell, most of them relate to shading. The first thing that we're going to do to correct any unusual shading is we're going to come to our Materials tab, and we're going to order them in a very specific order, depending on what we have in our molecule. So we'll start by having carbon come first, then hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and if we had them, sulfur, then fluorine. This can technically be customized however you'd like, but the default setup is based on what I anticipated people using most commonly, or the elements that would most often occur in common compounds. In our ungrouped setup, you'll also notice that we have some relatively basic controls. We can adjust the bond thickness, and this time we can go all the way to 0, which is very convenient for animation. We can also adjust the atom size and the resolution of both the atoms and the bonds. We can also see how the materials are set up, and there's an option here to toggle between instances and mesh. In the mesh version, we can actually load up our specific materials, and then if we wanted to, any modification that would occur here will be reflected on the atom in the screen. However, in the instance version, where we have less geometry, you can see toggling here immediately increases our amount of geometry. Now we will add 2 new materials in. Specifically, we're going to come down to the bottom, we're going to add AndMat atoms and AndMat bonds. These come by default and are immediately imported. They are specific to the individual molecule and they control all of the shading. You can see this is the presupposed order of elements in the molecule, so carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but each of these is just its own shader. And if I wanted to, I could very simply remove this or edit it. We'll come to the shading tab quickly to do that. So in the shading tab, you can see I've got this shader called oxygen. Materials tab, I can edit this to just call it atom number 3 with F2. Now it is reflected here. And if I wanted to, I could adjust this and it would be whatever I would like. Let's say we'll go with a green. Note that this is only changing for the bonds because both the atoms and the bonds are controlled separately. If you want to quickly update those, you can just copy this, or you could copy the entire principled shader. That's one of the benefits here. And then you could import that. So let's say I'm going to make this metallic. I'm going to give it a roughness of 0.65. And now this is pretty different than the atom shader. So I want to update that quickly. I'm going to select this, copy, come to animate atoms. I'm going to actually delete this oxygen, paste in that shader, which I will have to grab again. So copy, now paste. Here is our atom 3 shader, and we can just plug that into atom number 3, and now our atoms and bonds are both the same. While this adds a little bit more complexity, it does give you the freedom to customize this however you like. You can actually use image textures or full-on procedural setups for every individual atom and bond separately, which is a little bit of extra tuning options if you want them. One case that is worth addressing is what if you happen to have a molecule that didn't have an element in that order? So there is no oxygen per se, and it skips right to nitrogen. We'll show a quick example here of working with pyridine. This is our example setup for pyridine. You can see I've already ordered everything and added in the shaders. We've got our atomic instance core setup that we've ungrouped, and you can see that our atom here is red. I would like this to be blue for nitrogen. Unfortunately, again, this is oxygen. However, as I mentioned before, this is only a placeholder name, so I could come to the shading tab right away, and I could just change this to actually be blue. Or alternatively, a different approach is I could add a dummy material that doesn't do anything. So I can just put that in and we'll call this oxygen. And I'm just going to move this up above the nitrogen and that will automatically correct. From here, we'll return to our example molecule of caffeine to look at how we can make some adjustments and customizations to these molecules. As of this release, there are a number of extra controls, but in this video, we're only really going to look at basic customization options. For starters, I want to scale my specific atoms, starting with the hydrogens. I'm going to create some space between my material setup and my build atoms node. Then I'll come to scale options, so modify atoms, basic transforms, and I have scale. There's also compound transforms and other modifications, but I'm just going to go ahead, grab the scale atoms node, put it in place, and again, these selections are based on the material slots. So slot 1 is carbon, 2 is hydrogen, 3 is oxygen, nitrogen, etc., etc. There are a number of different options, and you can actually see in the materials nodes that this goes all the way down to 6 by default with an extra 4 if you want to customize them yourself. So you could add in or work with molecules that have a large number of different atoms. In this case, we want to modify the hydrogen, so I'm going to change the selection to 2, and then I can adjust the scale of just that atom right here. If I wanted to, I can also enable non-uniform scale, and then I can adjust the atoms in a specific axis. It is still possible to modify the individual bonds by manipulating the curves, and you can see under atomic instances that there are some index-based curves for selecting bond segments or full bonds, namely just this half or the entire stretch. This is based on indices, which you would have to visualize using the attribute overlay text, which you can just find right here. Then you could add in an index node, and you could search and see where the different values are. So this would let you manipulate aspects of the geonodes very specifically. If we grab a full bond, then you can see that we would want to manipulate, let's say, 4 and 5 for this bond, and 62 and 63. 62 and 63. Now, if we wanted to, we could simply go ahead, grab a set curve radius, input this into split bonds. You can see that we're shrinking that value quite substantially, and now we are only adjusting this segment right here. So this would allow us to manipulate just this bond, or if we wanted to, we could actually only manipulate this half of it by making this, again, 4 and 5. And so now we're only going to manipulate the one half of that segment. There are going to be controls in the future that make this more straightforward for just modifying everything associated with an element. It's still a work in progress. One other thing I'd like to note is that if you are working with different molecules in the same scene, you might want to make different copies of ANMAT atoms and ANMAT bonds. This would allow you to have them be isolated so you could separate the two out and make changes in one without impacting the other. I recognize that all of this is relatively complex, but the benefit here is that because each of these objects are controlled by their own geometry nodes and each of these shaders are controlled separately, you can do pretty much whatever you want with these, including all kinds of specific customizations to shading in terms of geometry nodes manipulation. And again, everything here is relatively efficient in terms of the size of the specific molecule. Similarly to Atomic Mesh, Atomic Instances also offers other basic options and more advanced node-based work that can be done using the underlying points and curves. Everything from simulation nodes to some of these simpler things that have been included by default, such as swapping between different atoms. So we could replace an atom based on a specific ID. If we want to do that, we'll go ahead, we'll move our molecules over here. I'm going to grab replace atom, put it in place, grab the original atom points, and now let's say I want to add Suzanne into this scene, subdivision modifier of 2, and I will drag Suzanne in here, use this to replace all of my carbon atoms with Suzanne's. And because these are, again, instances, this is very efficient, and I have all the nice instance-based controls for rotation and for modifying in this capacity. There are plenty of other things that both of these systems can do, and I will be putting together additional demonstrations for my Unlisted series in the future, along with a closer look at how both of these work together with Atomic Blender. From here, we're going to go back to Avogadro 2 to create an electrostatic potential surface that we can overlay on our molecule. We'll also do a quicker version of the whole process from importing in Avogadro 2 all the way to working with atomic instances, and we'll do that using vanillin as an example. That was a clip that was shown at the beginning of this video. However, before we do that, we're just going to compare the amount of geometry generated by each of these using an index switch. We'll go ahead, we'll grab a utilities index switch. We're going to show our original geometry in position 0, atomic mesh in slot 1, and atomic instances in slot 2. We'll go ahead and connect that to the output, and you can see on index 0, we have 24,000 verts corresponding to our low poly imported molecule. For slot 2 with atomic mesh, this number jumps up to 77,000. However, this is entirely due to our render smooth. If we disable this, that drops down to about 4. So you can see between atomic mesh and the default, we're already saving about 20,000 verts. And if we go even further to atomic instances, that number drops down to 1,000, showing that this setup is really much more efficient and gives you probably the most control through geometry nodes specifically. With all that said, let's go ahead and move back to Avogadro and get started with that potential surface. Back in Avogadro, we'll once again add in our molecule through File, Import, Download by Name, and Caffeine. We're going to optimize this again with Control, Alt, and O, and then to add in our surface, we're going to come to Analysis, Create Surfaces. There are a number of default options here, and we're going to modify a few of them. For surface, we want to change from van der Waals to either accessible or excluded. If you stick with van der Waals, larger molecules might have the surface clipped and it will not appear nicely. So I'm going to go with excluded for the time being. For color by, I'm going to choose electrostatic potential and stick with the default setting, although there are a number of options here. For color map, I'm going to go with turbo. Normally it is on balance by default. Turbo will give the kind of rainbow spectrum that you typically see in a lot of organic chemistry textbooks. Resolution I will leave alone, and for smoothing I'm going to choose a strong option. From here, simply hit calculate. We'll exit out of this, and you can see right away we have our electrostatic potential surface. With our navigation tool, we can navigate around and see sort of what we're looking at, regions of electron density or electron deficiency in our molecule. Before exporting this, there are a few things we could do. If we wanted to, we could hide the ball and stick so that we're just exporting this surface. I'm actually going to keep the ball and stick because I find it useful for aligning to the molecule that we created in Blender. To export this, we're very simply going to go to File, Export, and we're going to go with PLY Render. I'm going to save this with a somewhat informative name, and then we can return to Blender. In Blender, we can import our surface through File, Import, Stanford PLY. Simply select the surface with its default settings and go ahead and click Import. You can see right away that this is very small. In fact, the first thing we're going to do is hit Z, come into a wireframe mode, and then using that internal molecule, we'll align it to the one that we imported with the PDB. I'll hit 7 on my number pad for a top view, or you can simply use the adjustment here, and then we'll just scale this up It does not have to be entirely perfect. You can also use G and Shift-C to move this around in plane, but a rough overlap should be good. Now we're going to clean up this surface. Before I do that, I'm also going to parent this to the caffeine molecule. So to demonstrate that, I will come to a solid view. You can see I can click my surface. I obviously cannot access the molecule, so in the outliner, I'll hit Control, left-click caffeine, and then hit Control and P to parent to object. Now, if I want to make sure that the caffeine surface does not get in the way, I could uncheck this little arrow, and that will make it unselectable. Anytime I select anything, it will just catch the caffeine underneath. For now, I do need to be able to modify my surface, so I'm going to re-enable this. If you don't see this arrow, it's because you need to enable it through the restriction toggles, this little funnel at the top, and just make sure that this little arrow here has a blue window around it. To clean up the surface, we're going to select it in edit mode, and you'll notice that we have a lot of verts in our scene right now. So we're going to tab, we're going to see we have a ton of geometry, A to select everything, it's all triangles as well, so we'll hit M, we'll merge by distance. You can see we removed already almost half of that. Now we actually want to get rid of the molecule, the ball and stick model that came from Avogadro, and again in wireframe, we're going to Alt-A to deselect everything. We'll hover over part of the surface and hit L. Because everything is now linked, it will only isolate the surface. We can then hit Control and I, hit X, and then delete the verts associated with just the geometry, meaning that now the only molecule in the scene is the one that we originally imported. If you wanted to rework this geometry so that it's not using triangles but is using quads instead, you can tab into edit mode, select everything, come to face, and then hit tries to quads. This isn't strictly necessary, and I'm not going to do it for this tutorial. From here, we're going to return to object mode, right-click, shade smooth, and then you can see in our solid view, we have a relatively smooth surface already. If you wanted to clean up some of the little bits and high features here, you could either add a subdivision surface, which will add a lot of geometry, or you can smooth in sculpting mode by very simply coming here and then grabbing the smooth brush and just applying this gently. You don't want to squish too much into the surface, so a light touch is best here. You can drop the strength, bring the radius up, and sort of paint in areas of smoothness into your surface. Again, this is entirely optional. To set up the shading for this surface, we're going to come to the Materials tab and add a new shader. We actually want to use an attribute that imported with this surface. You can find it under Data, and if you come to Color Attributes, you can see it right here, COL. There are two ways of doing this, both in the Materials tab or directly in the Principled shader. You can come, click this little yellow icon here, add in an attribute, and then simply type capital COL, or in the Shading tab, you can Shift-A, add in an input, attribute, col, it's right there, and we'll just import this. If we come into a rendered view, you can see all of our shading setup is already done. Now, obviously, we can't see through this, and we'd like to, so I'm going to make some cosmetic adjustments by increasing the transmission weight all the way up. We'll bring the roughness down to about 0.2, and you'll notice that this is going to distort everything quite heavily because it's essentially glass. There are two ways around this. One is to adjust the index of refraction. Something like this will give it a bit of a flatter shading. Or if you want to preserve that glassy look, we can simply add a solidify modifier. And this essentially tells Blender, this is just thin glass, allow the light to pass through. This is always going to look better when you have something underneath it and when things are a little bit smaller. So we'll do a little bit of cosmetic setup in the layout tab. Once again, I'm going to uncheck the arrow here so I can only grab my original molecule. It's already parented, so I can move everything around. We'll scale this down quite substantially, move it back into the center of the frame, and I'm going to add an underlying plane right here. We'll move our molecule up so it's hovering over top. Let's zoom in. You can see right here, now we have all of our light bouncing through. That's pretty nice. We'll actually make our caffeine surface just a little bit smoother with a roughness of 0. We can look through this perfectly. Again, bring this up, and this is going to allow us to combine all of our geometry nodes controls for adjusting the atoms with our surface. If we really wanted to, we could also link our surface through geometry nodes by simply dragging it in and then making the adjustments here. That's not something I'm going to visit in this tutorial. Finally, as a full overview, let's go from the top to see how fast this process can be when it's fully set up using Vanillin as an example. Let's quickly take a look at the full process. We're going to go to File, Import, Download by Name, and we're going to search for Vanillin. With our vanillin structure ready to go, we're going to go to Analysis, Create Surfaces, and then we're going to select Solvent Accessible. We'll color by electrostatic potential, and I'm going to use the Turbo Color Map with strong smoothing. We'll calculate that surface. Once that's done, we're going to go ahead and export a few things. We'll start by exporting the whole thing with PLY render. And we will also export our molecule itself by coming to File, Export, and simply naming this vanillin.pdb. In a new scene in Blender, we'll delete the default cube. Then we'll come to File, Import, PDB. We'll select our file, choose one of our created presets, import right away. Then with Control A, make instances real, Shift and left click any atom, Control J to join. Come to the GeoNodes tab, add a new tree, Shift A, come to CGFigures Assets, Atomic Nodes Instances, and the core setup. We'll put that right in place. I'm going to just move these apart by scaling in the X direction. Then we'll come to a rendered view. You can see that this is not quite right. The oxygens and the hydrogens have been switched. So we're going to come to the Materials tab, move the hydrogen up 1. We're also going to ungroup this with Control-Alt-G. I'll move this over, create some space between the materials and the atoms, and then we will add a Modify Atoms Basic Transform Scale. I'm going to change the hydrogens just to make them a little bit smaller. And this is roughly our full setup right away. From here, we're going to add our surface. Well, actually, from here, we're going to rename this to vanillin. I'm going to hit M and move it to a new collection. Then I will delete the existing collection imported by Atomic Blender, File, Cleanup, Purge Unused Data. We'll remove all of that. Then we're going to come to File, Import, Stanford PLY. We'll import our vanillin surface. In wireframe view, we're going to scale this up until the internal molecule that we can see right here matches up roughly with the one that we've just created using atomic instances. So something around here will be sufficient. Then we're going to tab into edit mode for our surface, A to select everything, M to merge by distance. You can see we removed over 1 million verts on this one. Alt-A to deselect everything, L to select just the surface, Control-I to invert that so that we get this inner molecule, X to delete that. And now we can set up our shading. So we'll come back to our layout page. I'm going to add a mesh, plane, scale this way up, and then drag it down with G and Z below the plane of the molecule. Then we will come to our surface here, which we will rename. In fact, we don't have to. It's already renamed vanillin surface. So we'll add a material. We're going to add an attribute here. The attribute will be color, which should be available through the color attributes, COL. So let's see if that appears. Coming into rendered view, you can see that that worked perfectly. We've got everything set up here. We'll increase the weight. We'll drop the roughness down to, let's say 0.1. And to deal with that distortion, we will add a solidify modifier. Then we can go ahead and hold down Control or Shift and left click our vanillin. Sorry, it is Control. We'll grab our vanillin surface, then we'll Control and left click vanillin in the outliner. Control P to parent to object. And now we will simply deselect the vanillin surface with this arrow so that anytime we select here, we only select the molecule. We can rotate this around freely and the surface will update with it. We can similarly scale. And this is essentially all the controls that we would need. If we wanted to modify the surface further, we could do so with some sculpting, but this wraps up the tutorial nicely. I have linked a number of videos and resources in the description for this video, including my previous workflows for molecules, as well as the CGFigures asset library. These are still valid using the approach with Avogadro2, and are worthwhile if you're working in older versions of Blender that do not have access to geometry nodes. For the asset library for the geometry nodes, as well as a variety of other tools, please note that the free version is available from CGFigures.ca. That's been linked in the description. There are optional paid versions. They're all the same. It really is just if you want to help contribute to it. Ultimately, moving forward, I'm hoping that molecular nodes will add one-click support for double and triple bonds. I believe this is a feature that should be possible. To the best of my understanding, MN works using the Python package biotype, and there is a tool in there for extracting bond information. I've experimented myself to add double and triple bonds, but I trust Brady Johntson to implement that much better than I will. If that feature comes in the future, I will update that in this video's description, indicating that that is a much better way to work and really should be the standardized way going forward. For now, I wanted the option available to anyone to manipulate geometry nodes and to use molecules themselves with an existing system, namely Atomic Blender, hence this video. Now with that, thanks for coming in. It's been a lot of work to prototype all of these and to integrate them into the library while engaging in other projects, updating parts of the library with new features. I had originally recorded this entire video and scrapped it after working on it for about 2 months because I just wasn't happy with it. So I would really like to thank everyone who supports CGFigures by purchasing the asset library, and especially those who support it on Patreon. I would also really like to note that Brady Johntson has started a Patreon for molecular nodes. CGFigures is proud to support that effort as a tertiary structure. I really want to emphasize that molecular nodes is one of the foremost tools in our community. I hope to show more of it and other additions and full features of my asset library in upcoming videos. But until then, you have yourselves a great old day.